I would say that it's interesting because I think that Oxford has a lot of departmental interest in addressing things like climate change, and it has a lot of interdisciplinary environmental projects that I think are better than Princeton. But the downside is that because Oxford is so distributed, it's made up of these 36 colleges. Basically, that means that each individual college has to do sort of sustainability projects on its own. So sometimes you'll be in a college that like doesn't even recycle. I mean, it can be pretty
Whoa.
bad.
Whoa. And then who guides those decisions? Is there like an independent board of each college that
Yes, it's like independent fiefdoms. I mean, don't get me started. And that's also part of why I think Oxford students have had trouble with divestment as well, because not only do they have to try to get the larger university to divest, each individual college also has their own endowment. So then they have to go to each individual college and try to get them to divest.
so it would be like you have to convince every res college
Right. You'd have to go
to
Butler,
sign on too.
Whitman, Wilson. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, I think we can get started. I see people are coming in. Welcome everybody who just joined. We're here once again with Shannon Osaka, who's my classmate in the class of 2017. Before we get started, we'd just like to acknowledge that Princeton University sits on land taken forcibly from the Lenni Lenape tribe. And if not for this pandemic, I think in normal circumstances, this event would be taking place on that campus. And a lot of us here are alums or current students of the university. Real quick introduction about me. I promise this will be 2 sentences. I graduated in 2017 with a concentration in computer science, also worked on sustainable energy. I did a Fulbright in Sweden looking at local solar energy markets, and now work at a utility in Vermont on emerging technologies like electric vehicles and battery storage. And so if anyone's interested in that, current students looking for careers, please feel free to reach out. An intro on Divest Princeton. So Divest Princeton is a coalition of current students, faculty, staff, and alumni pushing for Princeton to divest its endowment from fossil fuels and reinvest its endowment in ethical investments. We have a lot of information online on our website, which can be linked through our Facebook page if you'd like to learn more about the movement and how to get involved. We always need and love more support, and currently going through the process of making this recommendation and proposing to the Resources Committee, which I will let Shannon describe what that body does and how it relates to the divestment process. And then on Shannon, a real quick introduction on her. Shannon graduated Princeton in 2017 with an independent concentration focusing on the science, sociology, and policy of climate change. As a Daniel Sachs Scholar at Oxford University, she co-founded the Oxford Climate Review magazine, Anthroposphere. She's now a full-time reporter for Grist, where she writes about clean energy, climate change, and environmental justice. Her writing has also appeared in Wired, Rolling Stone, and Slate, and she brings a really unique lens to the Princeton divestment campaign because she was on the Resources Committee, a key body in the decision-making process. And so really excited to have Shannon here. Welcome, Shannon. Welcome, everyone else. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Of course. So I think I'd like to start with your experience on the Resources Committee. Can you give a little bit of how the group works, what it is, and the criteria that they look at when recommending divestment?
Yeah, so the Resources Committee is a small body. I think of it, I mean, I'm just going to get right into it and say that I think basically the role of the Resources Committee is to slow down and impede progress on divestment. I was on the Resources Committee in my senior year. It is still somewhat of a mystery to me how I ended up on the committee, because prior to being on the committee, I was active in the Princeton Sustainable Investment Initiative, which was sort of a precursor to Divest Princeton. That wasn't necessarily calling for full divestment, but we were trying to sort of work with what we thought the university would go for, which, I think in some ways we were wrong. So the Resources Committee is this small group. It's made up of faculty, a couple administrators, and some students. I believe it's 2 undergraduate students and 1 graduate student. And the role of the Resources Committee is essentially to look at these bids for divestment that come up. So when I was on the committee, we were looking at private prison divestment. it was one of the more, I've served on a lot of university committees because I was on the undergraduate student government. Um, Being on the resources committee was one of the more frustrating things that I went through in terms of dealing with the Princeton bureaucracy, just because it became increasingly clear while I was on the committee that uh, that the goal of the committee was really to look at these criteria for divestment and interpret them in sort of the strictest possible way, which meant that divestment was unlikely to ever happen. Um, I believe there's three conditions that the committee is supposed to examine to determine whether divestment should happen. They say there has to be considerable, thoughtful, and sustained campus interest in an issue, that the corporations have to be in direct and serious violation of a central university value, and that there has to be a consensus on how the university should respond to the situation. And those are not really defined in any substantive way for the committee as you go through. I mean, what counts as a central university value? That's sort of up for debate. What counts for thoughtful, sustained campus interest? Also up for debate. What counts as consensus in terms of within the university community? Also hugely up for debate. And so I think that there's just all of these hoops that student activist groups have to jump through in order to try to get, acknowledgement from the resources committee, and those hoops kind of keep moving.
Yeah, and so I think the three criteria you just mentioned, those are all written out in sort of the official guidance to the resources committee from the board. I'm wondering, did you receive any other informal guidance, or while you were on the committee, who was speaking to you, who kind of was interpreting those board mandates?
Yeah, so we did have a representative from Princo come in. I believe it was the head of Princo, which is the university's investment company. And he came in and sort of talked about the purpose of the endowment, which is to basically continue to grow in perpetuity, and the responsibility that Princo has to like the people who have donated to Princeton in the past. And there is kind of a sense, there was a sense in what he was talking about that, the university had divested in two previous instances. One was in the case of genocide, and one was in the case of apartheid in South Africa. And there was kind of a sense like, okay, these are the things that are worthy of divestment.
Hmm.
So genocide, apartheid, anything that doesn't reach that level, we should be very skeptical of.
Hmm.
Um, and I mean, I think that that's, again, it's an extremely high bar, and that's not articulated in any of the guidelines, but that was sort of something that kept underlying the discussions that we had.
Mm-hmm. And I know you hit on this a little earlier when you said you're not even sure how you ended up on the committee, but is there a formal process to join? Are there term limits? What sort of guidelines govern how that body works?
Yeah, that's a really good question. To be honest, I really don't know why. I don't know how the faculty side works. I don't know if faculty, I don't know if they volunteer. I don't know if there are term limits. I know that some of the faculty that I served on the committee with are still on the committee today. So that's at least a 4-year term. The students tend to sort of turn over as necessary. I was recommended to the committee apparently by the Office of the Dean of Undergraduate Students. And I think that my understanding is I think that someone was potentially in favor of prison divestment and wanted a student on the committee who had not worked on prison divestment, but had known interest in divestment in other forms, because I had worked with PSII. But essentially, the way that I got on the committee was just I got an email from someone in Otis, an administrator, who said, "Oh, you have been nominated to serve on the resources committee. Could you do a short interview?" We did an interview at the library, and then he said, "You're on." So it was sort of an obscure process, and I'm really not sure, again, like how the other undergraduate student or the graduate student ended up on the committee.
And I think the point on sustained interest, I wanted to highlight that there was a previous fossil fuel divestment campaign in 2015, led by the Princeton Sustainable Investment Initiative, that did not go through. The resource committee did not recommend to the board that they follow up with divestment. How often has the Resources Committee played a proactive role in changing board policy? I know you mentioned the two previous instances where the university did divest. Were those results of Resource Committee recommendations?
That's a really good question. I'm not sure. I don't think that the Resources Committee existed at that
Hmm.
time. My understanding was that the Resources Committee was created in response to more recent like calls for divestment from various things um, like oil companies or like
Hmm.
private prisons. But that was
Right.
that's an interesting question. It might need some research. I will say
Sure.
also
Sure.
that in the cases of those previous divestments, I think like Princeton was not on the leading edge.
Hmm.
It was more like other universities were doing this. Everyone was divesting from companies involved in apartheid in South Africa. And Princeton was like, okay, we better jump on this too.
Hmm. And so I think one of the unique requirements Princeton does have is a mandate that the university can only move forward with divestment if we're willing to completely dissociate from the company or industry in question. I think this has been construed very narrowly to mean if we consume fossil fuels as a university, therefore we cannot divest. What's your opinion on that requirement?
Yeah, this is sort of a weird requirement in that I believe it originates from an Gruber letter to the Resources Committee. It's not in those main three, like, we
Hmm.
previously listed the main three requirements, the sustained interest, the conflict with the central university value, the consensus. This is not one of them. But Gruber has said, and we received a letter from him when we started our work on the Resources
Hmm.
Committee, where he says that we can only divest if we wish to disassociate from the company in all other aspects of our operations. So this is a particularly tricky requirement
Hmm.
for something like oil companies or climate change, because basically the argument is, well, if we are connected to the grid, like if Princeton University is connected to the electricity grid, which uses some energy from fossil fuels, then therefore we have not fully disassociated in all aspects of our operations. And there's another level to this too, which is if we're going to dissociate, then that means that we should no longer accept research funding
Hmm.
from those organizations. And I
Hmm.
think obviously Divest Princeton has done a couple events talking about, the research funding that Princeton receives from these energy companies. And I'm not aware of other major universities having this requirement. There are many universities which have divested from fossil fuels and continue to get research funding from Exxon or Shell or BP.
Hmm.
So yeah, it's a very, very high bar.
Yeah, yeah, and I think it's in a way kind of an infinite loop where it's only by divesting can we kind of take away some of these companies' powers to have that influence, so that it becomes hard to dissociate. And so
Right.
I think it is particularly thorny. I think too, in the letter that President Eisgruber had sent in 2015 in response to that fossil fuel divestment campaign, he brought up the question of who is to blame for climate change. I think his exact words were, "It's an issue that relates to all of us, not a few bad actors." And I think this issue is who is to blame is really central to both the divestment movement and your writing. And I think there was one article in particular talking about the Losing Earth New York Times article that you'd written about in Grist, and how oil companies have shifted their strategies over time around this issue of who's to blame. Can you talk a little bit about that based on your research and writing?
Yeah, so Losing Earth was this huge magazine article. It took up the entire New York Times magazine for one issue in the summer of 2018. And it was by this guy, Nathaniel Rich, and he tells the story of the 1980s where, there was a brief moment where it seemed like action on climate change could really be taken. There was some Republican support, there was some Democratic support. It seemed like this could be something like the ozone hole where we could just, pass an international climate treaty and then we would move on and live happily ever after. And Nathaniel Rich sort of painted the issue of climate change as a problem of basically human nature.
Mm.
He said that, humans were really bad at thinking long term. And so we have a really hard time thinking about, this risk that might come somewhere down the line. And so I wrote just sort of a response to that saying, well, it's not really human nature. He was basically making this argument that it's impossible for humans to cooperate together to address a problem in the long term, or it's very difficult. And I think it is difficult, but there's lots of examples throughout history where people have been able to do this. And another thing that a lot of people pointed out about the article was that he ignored this sort of massive machine of fossil fuel company denialism that was actually just getting revved up in the 1980s. Fossil fuel companies, there's been lots of research on this, but fossil fuel companies had their scientists were talking about climate change as early as the 1980s. And then they started to sort of wind down those research programs. Like Exxon really cut back on its research program into climate change because they were like, well, this is a threat to our business. And one of the things that companies did was respond with ideas about personal accountability. So like BP and its Beyond Petroleum campaign basically really pushed the idea of carbon footprints. So the idea of carbon footprints had been around before, but BP was like, every individual person should calculate their carbon footprint. And so there was this idea of trying to sort of shift blame for climate change onto the individual and say, you person should ride a bike, or you should, drive less. It's not really the oil company's fault. It's not the fault of what you're plugged into on the grid. And this, I think that this is a difficult problem because there is this kind of debate in climate change. It's like, oh, should we think of the collective responsibility? Should we think of fossil fuel company responsibility? Should we think of individual responsibility? And obviously all of those components are involved. But, the worst thing that fossil fuel companies have done is just to really try to redirect that energy onto the individual instead of onto government programs that could provide incentives to move away from fossil fuels, which in theory would actually be not terrible for fossil fuel companies because they could adapt, they could move into renewable energy, all these kinds of things.
Yeah. And I think just a shout out for anyone who wants to dig deeper into this topic specifically. We had another chat with Ben Franta that's on the Divest Princeton Facebook page that talks a lot about this history of deferring and delaying by the fossil fuel industry and how they've kind of over time placed a burden on all of us to deflect from their role in pushing for against emission reduction targets and mandates and renewable portfolio standards. So it did fizzle my brain a little bit when I heard Ben talk and dug deeper into just how egregious some of these actions have been. I think related to that is sort of that a lot of these oil majors in particular have touted their commitments to achieve net zero emissions, often by 2050, which I think is, sounds like a great goal. This includes BP, which has given over $40 million to Princeton research funding. And I think that these commitments often do deflect attention from the lobbying that these companies do fervently against climate action. And so I'm just curious, first, what does it mean when an oil major commits to net zero?
This is one of my biggest pet peeves. I wrote an article about this a little while ago, which said the headline was basically the problem with big oil's climate goals is that they don't include the oil. And I think that that's really true. And one of my pet peeves is that when one of these oil companies comes out with a statement like this, what often happens is that a lot of wire news services like Reuters or sometimes like the Associated Press will run just basically what the company said in their press release. They'll say, oh, BP has committed to net zero by 2050. And for the normal person who doesn't look deeply into these issues, they think, oh, that's great. I mean, problem solved, right? BP is going to net zero. They're going to cut their emissions. That's all fine. So this upsets me both about the oil company's PR, but also about journalists who are sort of uncritically covering these claims. And so companies can mean different things. One thing that they can mean is that they're going to reduce their emissions in the extraction of oil and gas. So great. I mean, basically they're committing to, they're going to use other sources of energy to extract oil and gas, or if they use fossil fuels, they're going to offset them by, planting trees or sucking carbon out of the atmosphere or something like that. Those extractions only account for about 10% of an overall company's, carbon footprint, to go back to that idea. And then there are other sort of ways to get around it too. BP has said that they're going to cut their emissions to net zero of all the oil and gas that they extract. So that's one step further. They're saying that they're actually going to be responsible for the burning of the oil and gas that they have pulled out of the ground, but only the oil and gas that they extract. So not the oil and gas that they buy from other companies, which is also like 2/3 of their business. So there is no oil company that I know of today that has said, we are actually going to reduce our overall company's footprint to net zero by 2050. It's always taking a small subset of what their business is. And that, because they're taking that small subset, that kind of provides a sense of everything is fine. They're following the Paris Agreement. They're going to be to net zero by 2050, as we all want. And it's really misleading.
Yeah, I think it in my mind is really related to some of these research partnerships that they tout, where they, you'll see, and you can find it on Exxon's Twitter page, but after firming up their partnership with the Andlinger Center at Princeton, there's a video that came out showing that Princeton and Exxon are collaborating on technologies like carbon capture and storage. And from that, it would be easy to overlook that they're investing, I think, less than 1% of their overall operating budget on renewable and clean technologies. That the vast majority of that budget is invested into conventional drilling and oil exploration. And so I think this is similar, where a really splashy headline is easy. It does a good job of deflecting from what's really going on under the hood.
Yeah.
Awesome. So in a kind of change of topics a little bit, and also just quick for the audience, please do post any questions you have in the chat. We'll definitely have an audience Q&A section in a little bit, but we'll get to it after some of the prepared questions. And so we please do put anything in the chat you'd like Shannon to hit on, and I promise we will have time to get to it. So in a recent piece, you discuss environmental groups' history, troubling history of racism. Can you tell us a little bit more about this history and whether these groups are making any progress to address environmental justice?
Yeah, I think that it's sort of a well-known secret about the environmental movement that many of the environmental movement's early leaders had really, really deeply troubling racist views. John Muir, who helped sort of start the Sierra Club, had very racist views about Native Americans and indigenous peoples in the American West. Henry David Thoreau did as well. Paul Ehrlich, who was sort of a 70s environmental, huge environmental thinker. He wrote this book, Population Bomb, where he was basically afraid that developing countries would have surges in populations that would destroy the earth when, in fact, we know that people in developing countries have such a smaller impact on the earth than we do in the West. So there is this sort of a lot of environmental groups. The people who founded them, or like long histories of their leaders, were sort of following in this trajectory that was about, preserving nature and thinking about conservation and things like that, and not really thinking about the people who are most affected by environmental degradation. And so I think that we're seeing, in the wake of the Black Lives Matter protests, we're seeing sort of a reckoning that's been coming for a long time with some of these environmental groups trying to reorient themselves towards racial justice. Just a couple days ago, the Sierra Club apologized for its association with John Muir. And they said, we apologize for his long history of calling Native Americans, horrible things. And then also we're seeing a move in environmental organizations toward climate justice and environmental justice. So that means acknowledging the fact that, climate change is disproportionately going to affect impoverished people around the world, but also in the United States. and that there are certain communities that are in the path of fossil fuel infrastructure who live under the shadow of these huge oil refineries, who have, health issues because of that, who are facing enormous air pollution. And so there's really a move across the entire environmental movement to start dealing with this. And I think that we have seen that in some of the emerging climate plans as well. So Joe Biden's climate plan has a lot of policies that are focused on justice and making sure that funding for clean energy goes to some of these communities. So it's a growing movement. I think we still have a long way to go. And I think the environmental movement in general is still pretty white, pretty focused on sort of the conservation aspect instead of on these justice aspects.
Great. Yeah, I think that all amazing points. I think we will shift now to some of the audience questions. First, I saw a question from Corey, which is transparency is a major protectionist tool used by the administration. How much info do members of the resource committee have access to, and specifically around what investments Princeton has made in fossil fuels? And do you think there's any room for disruption here, calling out there's a lack of transparency that we don't really know what's in the endowment?
That's a really good question. When I was on the resources committee, transparency was actually used kind of as a weapon. And the private prison divestment folks have a terrible firsthand experience of this, which is that when we were considering prison divestment, the Princo representative came in and actually told us that Princeton was not invested in private prisons. And this had never come, this had not come up. They had not told the prison divestment folks that this about this fact. So they told us, and then at one point when the group calling for prison divestment, those activists came in to meet with us, they sort of sprung this information on them to say, oh, by the way, Princeton, we've looked at the investments and we're not invested in any private prisons. And that it was one of the shadier things that I've seen, because it effectively just they were trying to basically take the wind out of the sails of these activists to say like, well, we're not currently invested. Now, there was no promise to not be invested in the future, which is what divestment would accomplish. But it was a way to say like, oh, we're already not invested, so maybe this just isn't a problem. And this is after these students had spent, years building this movement, building this momentum. So I think it can be used as a weapon. In the case of divestment from fossil fuels, I had no information while on the resources committee about how the extent to which the university was invested. I think that, it's likely that the university is invested to some extent, particularly if they're sort of invested across the board, because, many people are. But I think that there should be much greater transparency. And I think that it's hidden because under the idea that Princo needs to sort of hide their investment decisions in order to get a leg up on the market, right? Like, oh, if we tell everyone what we're invested in, that's bad. Like other people might steal our endowment secrets of our, 12% growth per year. And I think that is a not very sufficient argument to address like the large moral issues that come from being invested in some of these places.
We have a question submitted by Tom on behalf of someone who emailed it. How did your motivation to write about environmental issues get started? And how did it change, or maybe not, with time as you went through both Princeton and Oxford and started writing for Grist?
That's a really nice question. Yeah, I was interested in climate change from like basically the first time I was on Princeton's campus. I was originally, and it's kind of been a slow roll. I was originally a physics major. I switched to geosciences because I wanted to address, something that I felt was a really big problem. And then while I was in geosciences, I realized that I felt like the issues about climate change were actually not these climate science issues. I think that the work climate scientists do is incredibly important, but that what we really need was more sort of social understanding of what's preventing action, what are the political roadblocks. So I switched to my own independent major. And I was pretty convinced that I wanted to be in academia up until my first year at Oxford. And this is nothing against
Mm.
Oxford, which is a great institution, although extremely even older and more bureaucratic than Princeton.
We got a couple
Um,
100 years on us.
yeah, it does. And but I think that I just started to realize that the work that I was doing, I was looking at whether extreme weather events can
Hmm.
motivate people to act on climate change and whether
Hmm.
connecting those events to climate change is useful. But I just realized that, I was writing these things that were being seen by only a handful of people, and that I felt I could be more useful as a public facing writer of sort of translating some of this social science and translating some of this policy to a broader audience.
Hmm.
Yeah, so it's been sort of a slow roll of trying to figure out where I can be most effective.
Great. We have a question that came in from Luke. And Shannon, I'll pitch this to you, although more a question for Divest Princeton, but would love to get your take on it. So given Princeton's position as a conservative and slow to action institution, how do you think Divest Princeton can work with other divestment groups in order to build overall pressure on universities to make change?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's great that from what I've seen so far, a lot of divestment groups are working together across universities and sort of sharing strategies. I think that one of the best ways actually that will push Princeton towards divestment is the more of their peer organizations that they
Mhm.
see. I think unfortunately, Princeton is I mean, many of us on this call know this, but Princeton is a very conservative organization and rarely wants to be on the leading edge. And I think, this hasn't come up yet, but I think the the argument about the Woodrow Wilson School renaming is a
Mhm.
perfect example of this. Princeton had an opportunity to be on the leading edge, and Princeton's students were on the leading edge. They were saying, look, we have to address this. We have to address Woodrow Wilson's legacy of racism. We have to address racist problems in the institution as a whole. Because obviously that wasn't the only one of the Black Justice League's demands. They had a lot of different
Mhm.
suggestions. And and Princeton said, Princeton spent years, they had a committee as always to consider the issue and then ended up not doing it. And then of course, what compelled Princeton to ultimately change the name of the Woodrow Wilson School and Wilson College was when there was this huge, you know, society-wide,
Mhm.
countrywide, worldwide push to address racism. And I think that that's just a sign that Princeton is not going to lead. And so one of the things that will really help Divest Princeton move forward and the institution of Princeton move forward, I think, is them seeing other peer institutions making these moves.
Definitely. We have a question now from Morgan, who's an undergraduate student at Rutgers. This question I think is much more tailored to Shannon's expertise and interest, although you answered the last one beautifully. So you mentioned earlier that Princeton has divested from companies implicated in injustices on genocide and apartheid. Is there a way to frame climate change in a similarly urgent light, given that environmental harms disproportionately affect minority and low income populations? I think you do this so well in your writing. And so wondering, for groups like Divest Princeton or undergraduates in general, what can they take away from that, and how can they frame climate change more in that light?
Yeah, this is something I think about so much because I think that connecting the dots between climate change and these other harms, whether it's harms from extreme weather, whether it's harms from, people being forced to migrate, whether it's droughts, famines, all of these things, connecting those dots are really important to help people see that climate change is happening now. It's not something, I think there are a lot of people who still think, climate change is something that's 20 years down the line and maybe it will cause some bird species to go extinct. I mean, I think that that is really how some people are viewing it. And I think communication wise, I think journalists and other communicators, scientists have really improved in the last decade in showing that climate change is happening here and now. I think that one of the things that's really difficult is that, climate change is this sort of diffuse factor. And in any case of death, of disease, of famine, it's going to be one of many other social factors that is actually affecting that event. And so there's been a push in climate journalism to be able to connect particular deaths to climate change, like to say, these 1,000 people were killed because of climate change. And I think that I understand the push for that, but I think that it is also very difficult to do from a scientific perspective and from a modeling perspective to try to, trace that chain of causality. And so I try to really like thread the needle with this in my reporting and say, climate change made this more likely, more severe, things like that. But I think it's a difficult problem. That said, I do think that if, the Resources Committee and the Board of Trustees just sees more of those chains being connected, even if we can't say climate change definitely deterministically caused these 10,000 deaths, even if we say, look, this was a huge contributor, I think that that will help to push climate change more to the front of their minds. But I think that it's difficult. I think that it's a different type of problem. It's a different type of moral issue than most people are used to thinking about. And it's going to take a lot of communication and activist work to do that.
Yeah, it kind of hits the collective action problem and the long time scale, which humans are not the best at.
Exactly.
We have a question from Lynn, which is how big of a factor is donor money? The university refused to change the Woodrow Wilson name in 2015, as you mentioned, but last month it happened a week after Kwanzaa Jones asked for their name change, who had previously given $20 million to the university. Her question is, do we need some of the big environmental donors to push for that kind of change?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I think that's a great point, Lynn. And I remember reading the Dingley Princetonian had an article about Kwanzaa Jones and how she pushed Ice Gruber towards not towards divestment, towards changing the Woody Woo name. And I was like, well, that just makes perfect sense. I mean, that explains a lot of why the name change happened now. I do think that having environmental donors on board would be huge. I think that besides peer organizations, the best place to hit Princeton is in the wallet. And I think that one of the things that I love that Divest Princeton has been doing is trying to mobilize alumni to say that they're not going to give. And I think that this is a great way to express your disappointment or frustration with Princeton and what they're doing. I don't plan on donating to Princeton until they've divested from fossil fuels. I would encourage others to do the same. Unfortunately, I'm a sort of early career journalist. We are not necessarily in the most lucrative fields. And so if I had $20 million that I could hold back from Princeton, I think that that statement would be a lot stronger.
Yeah, so everyone in the audience, make a ton of money, make it seem like you're going to give to the university, and then pull it back until they divest. That's the takeaway here. And Lynn had a great comment that so far we have over 1,000 people, 1,114 people who've pledged to withhold donations until the university divests. So you can absolutely encourage you all to do that on the Divest Princeton website. There's a pledge you can sign, and I am right there with you, Shannon, that I think that is the place that can really hit the university where it counts, and the potential to have a lot of widespread momentum as more folks find out about that pledge. Awesome. So I think if there's no other audience questions, we'll kind of get to the final questions for Shannon. One is, as a journalist, how do you think about communicating the urgency of climate change without, frankly, bumming people out to the point that they're paralyzed from doing action? And so I wonder if you have any thoughts on how to communicate that effectively without it being overly burdensome and people just getting depressed.
There's actually this was one of the first things that pushed me towards the social sciences of climate change. There's some great research about basically using fear as a motivating tool. When you tell people something scary, when you say, your city could be underwater by 2050, if you tell people that and you don't give them any basis for action, people tend to just like shut off. They're like, that's scary. I don't know what I can do, so I'm going to turn away. But if you say the same thing and you include what's called self-efficacy, which is basically pointing people towards things that they can do, whether it's joining a movement for divestment, whether it's, something related to their personal carbon footprint, even though we've talked about how that's somewhat flawed. But any of those things, then people are able to focus more on that scary thing. They're able to look at it and say, okay, I can address this. So I think about this all of the time in my reporting. I think it's so, so important. And I'm just not really interested. I think it's important to cover some of those sort of scary statistics of, we know that, this could happen by 2100 or 2050, but that's not where my interest lies. My interest is like solutions. So what are the policy solutions that people can work towards? What are the activist solutions that are being pushed for? And I think that is also the thing that's really missing in a lot of mainstream media coverage of climate change. I think there's definitely been a movement towards the solutions angle in recent years, but I think that a lot of people are tired of hearing about all the bad things that happen, and they want to know what they personally can do. So I try to cover a lot of political movements. I try to cover policy things, even though the US Congress is, another slow moving bureaucratic organization. I try to cover those things because that's one of the avenues for change.
And then as a quick follow-up to that, for any aspiring journalists who are listening in, do you have any words of advice for them?
Oh, sure. I mean, I would say if anyone is an aspiring environmental journalist, do get in contact with me. I'd be happy to sort of give some advice and tips. I would just say that I think one of the most important things is to work from your area of expertise. So I have had just I've had some luck in environmental journalism because I studied it for so long and have this sort of huge wealth of academic knowledge sitting in the back of my brain that I no longer want to use for academic purposes. So I think work from your strengths. I think journalism is a very tough gig right now, particularly because of the economic downturn and layoffs and things like that. But there's lots of room to freelance. There's lots of room to sort of find those unique individual stories that only you can write, that perspective that only you have. Yeah, and definitely get in contact with me.
Awesome. And a quick plug on the answer to the last question. So I know you talk about being very solutions oriented. There's actually a professor who followed you from Princeton to the UK, who's now working at Cambridge, named Sander van der Linden, who's done a ton of great work on the literal warm glow we feel when we act in pro-environmental, pro-sustainability way. So there's evidence that we actually feel better when we make these decisions, and it's really interesting work. He does a lot of cool stuff in environmental decision making. So check him out. He's done a lot of popular science writing in addition to his academic
work. I love
work.
Sander. I've interviewed him a couple of times. He is great. Yeah.
Awesome. So last two, I promise we'll wrap up soon. Do you have any recommendations for the Divest Princeton movement, given some of the challenges you've talked about before with the Resources Committee? What do you think would be effective ways to engage, if not only through that committee?
Yeah, I think we talked about this a little bit a couple of weeks ago, but I do think that the Resources Committee is designed to be a roadblock. I don't know of an example in history when the Resources Committee pushed forward a recommendation for divestment, although, historians of Princeton correct me if I'm wrong. And so I think that Divest Princeton will have to I think you have to still engage with the Resources Committee because that is the approved upon route that Icegruber and the administration have laid out. But I think all of these engagements that cut around the corner, so, encouraging alumni to withhold donations, I still think is one of the most powerful tools. I think potentially talking to members of the Board of Trustees and petitioning members of the Board of Trustees directly, because they're the ones who make the big decisions. The Resources Committee only recommends to the Board of Trustees. The Board of Trustees still has to make their own decision. And so they're very important in this as well. And then I think what Lynn said, getting if you can get major environmental donors to hold back funding, that would be huge. And then also shaming Princeton with the examples of pure institutions.
Great. We did get one last question that came in from the audience that asked about the sort of participation in giving, which Princeton is very focused on. They love to highlight some of the percentages of how much of each class gives. And so do you think that there's scope for broader withholding of funding, even if it's small amounts, to move the needle, or is it just the total amount that makes a difference?
So my recollection, and I would have to fact check this, is that one of the things that why Princeton pushes so hard for alumni to, like, they want you to donate even $1, is because in the many of the college and university rankings, one of the factors that they take into account is how much of your recent alumni or long-term alumni donate. So I think that that is huge. I mean, if recent alumni donations went down from, whatever they are, it's often like, I think 90% or higher, to 20%, that has the potential to actually push Princeton down in the US news rankings, which would be devastating. I mean, there's a reason. I mean, Princeton is a great institution, but the alumni funding does play into why we have as high a position as we do. And so I do think that there's room for that, both in moving the needle financially, but also in moving the needle about how Princeton thinks of itself as an institution and how Princeton maintains, a high ranking. And Princeton loves its, we have reunions is a very unique Princeton affair. And so I think that Princeton really prides itself on its alumni relationships. And if there's a sign that those relationships may be fraying, I think that could move the needle.
Definitely. And yeah, I think that that's something where for anyone in the audience, various classes, to talk to your class reps who run the big giving campaigns to see if they might be open to encouraging classmates to donate to other very worthy causes. We understand that giving back to universities and to education is important for a lot of people, but there's a lot of groups working on this that are not university endowment funds, and a lot of those are listed on the Divest Princeton website for those who are looking to find alternative groups that they could give some of that really important money to. The last question for you, Shannon, is to take a step back for a minute. Why do you think divestment matters in combating climate change?
Yeah, that's a great question. There's a lot of sort of disagreement about divestment's economic impact on companies. And I think that this is usually one of the top arguments against divestment. Everyone's like, well, if you divest, then someone else is just going to pick up those investments. So you're not hitting, the oil companies in their finances. And I think that this is the wrong way. And there's disagreement about that, but I think that that's one of the wrong ways to think about it, is that there is definitive proof, and oil companies have said that the divestment movement is a threat to their business plan because it provides all of this negative PR. And so I think that one way to think about divestment is that I think the divestment movement is part of why oil companies have started pushing for things like net zero. It's part of why they now feel the requirement to say, oh, we're looking into all of these alternative clean energy sources. I think that sort of demonstration of public, disavowal and disapproval of oil and gas companies is pushing them towards making some changes. I think that it's not nearly enough. And I think that I have very little hope that oil and gas companies will suddenly turn around and become climate leaders. But it also, I think, is forcing people to rethink, well, do we really want to be involved with these companies? Do we want to sort of try to change our energy sources to other to renewables? Do we want to try to disconnect from these companies entirely? So I think that it's really important because it's a very strong way to show public disapproval of what they're doing.
Well, Shannon, thank you so much for your time today. Thank you everyone else who joined. A quick reminder that this full recording of this video will be on the Divest Princeton Facebook page. For those who want to check it out after the fact, share it with your friends. For those currently here in the Zoom chat, we will. It looks like Tom has posted a link to the Divest Princeton website, which has a lot of the resources I mentioned before. For those who are joining after through the recorded video, all of that information, it's linked to on the Divest Princeton Facebook page. You can also check us out on Instagram. And so visit the website, which will have a lot more info on how to take action on some of the issues you heard about today. Shannon, I will give you the last word. And once again, thank you so much for your time. It was amazing to hear some of your insights on these. Really appreciate you joining.
Thank you so much for having me, Graham. And I think the last word is just that one of the things I've learned from being in the climate change space is that there really is a place and a need for everyone. So whether that's pushing for divestment from some place like Princeton, whether that's like pushing for divestment in your own company or pushing your company or organization to move towards cleaner energy, I think anything that we can do is helpful, and it's going to take a lot of different personalities and a lot of different points of focus.
Awesome. Well, with that, thank you again. Thanks everyone for joining, and hope you all have a great weekend.